Welcome to the Finance and Capital Committee. I'm the Chairman, Steve McMillan. First, we will discuss the agenda. If I trust the committee's had a chance to review it, if there are no objections, we will consider it approved as presented. With no objection, the agenda is approved. Next, we have the minutes from our previous meeting before us for approval. Any objections to the minutes as presented? Hearing none, we'll consider the minutes approved as presented. Today, we have 3 items on the agenda. First, staff is asking for board approval to execute a joint development agreement at West Falls Church Metro Rail Station. Next, we'll consider the termination of the Prince George's County parking surcharge and associated actions in concert with the county and Maryland Transportation Authority. And finally, the committee will be asked to approve public hearings on the general manager's proposed fiscal year 2022 operating budget and capital improvement program. This will begin the process of soliciting feedback on a rather unique budget in the history of Metro. I'd like to remind my colleagues and the public that while the board is voting today to authorize hearings, the actual comment period for the public portion of the process won't open until mid-January. This will allow staff to prepare materials to explain the very complicated service changes proposed as part of this budget and to ensure that information is accessible and understandable to all of Metro's riders and stakeholders. For discussion purposes, I'll note that Mr. Devin Rouse will be participating in Mr. Horner's place on the budget item since Mr. Horner is recused from this matter. As a reminder for presenters, please introduce yourself before you begin. As a reminder to participants, please mute your microphones when you're not speaking to cut down on background noise. With that, I will turn the floor over to Ms. Nina Albert to begin today's presentations.
Okay, great. My name is Nina Albert. I'm the Vice President of Real Estate and Parking at Metro. And today we are seeking board approval for a joint development agreement at West Falls Church Metro Station. We're also seeking board approval to hold a compact public hearing for changes to the mass transit plan that would result from entering into this agreement. The board had previously approved the issuance of a joint development solicitation in January of 2019, which staff issued in March of that year. We selected a joint venture team comprised of EYA, Hoffman and Associates, and Rushmark in September of 2019, and the developers have been engaged in the Fairfax County Comprehensive Plan Amendment process since then. The site in question is the 24 acres south of I-66 at the West Falls Church Metro Station. Given that ridership declined by 74% at this station once phase 1 of the Silver Line opened in 2014, what was previously a highly used parking hub is now an underutilized site, making it more feasible to offer for joint development. Public coordination is at the heart of the success of this project. The development of Metro's property is not the whole story, because the vision for a mixed-use transit-oriented development started in March of 2018, when the City of Falls Church offered 10 acres of their land within the walkable half-mile of the Metro Station. Subsequent to that, Virginia Tech, which owns a property between the Metro site and the City of Falls Church site, also entered into a public-private agreement to redevelop their property. The total of the 3 public parcels can deliver 3.3 million square feet of new development within walking distance of the West Falls Church Metro Station. The development program on Metro's 24 acres assumes a 3-phase project and a total of 1 million square feet that includes multifamily units, townhomes, retail, and office. We will ground lease all of the sites except for the townhome properties, which we will sell to the developer. The developers are also responsible for building a new road network to accommodate buses, pickup and drop-off activity, and other transit needs. The development on our property alone is estimated to generate 600 new daily riders per year once the project is completed. As is often the case with joint development, Metro staff makes proposals to amend the mass transit plan. This is true at West Falls Church as well, where we are seeking board approval to hold a compact public hearing to reduce the number of park and ride spaces by up to 800, to reduce the number of metered parking spaces by 44, and finally, to reduce the number of bus bays by up to 4. To be clear, Metro, the developer, and Fairfax County are still vetting through the comprehensive planning process the exact number of spaces that we would bring forward for public comment. And the numbers today that are shared on this screen represent the maximum facility changes that the parties are considering. With that, I'll answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Albert. I don't have any questions. We've seen this project evolve over the course of a few months and getting pretty familiar with it. Before we go on, can I ask for a motion and a second from committee members?
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Moved by Mr. Smedberg and second. By, thank you. Okay. So moving on, Mr. Meridian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any questions.
Great. Mr. Slater.
No questions for me. Thank you.
Mr. Smedberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Albert, question about the parking. I followed up with a question about that yesterday. Could you give us a little more insight as to your discussions with Fairfax County? I know there is some concern there about particularly the 200 spots, that are part of, I think, phase 3 it is. Could you tell us a little bit more about your discussions there and how you're working with the county to address some of the concerns they might have given the overall number of parking spots that may ultimately be on the site?
Absolutely. So right now, the site, let me go back to our existing conditions. Here we go. The site, as you can see here, has a parking garage and 2 large size surface parking lots. The Metro station is at the top of the screen, and a very popular lot is this, what we'll call the north parking lot, right along I-66, the one that's closest to the Metro station. And as I mentioned, in total, between the 2 surface parking lots and the garage is a total of about 2,000 parking spaces. This project, and all 3 projects together, ours, as well as Virginia Tech's and then City of Falls Church, because of the amount of development that is being introduced into a relatively compact space, is going through a process right now of needing to vet the total traffic impact to the road network in the area. This is something that, frankly, all 3 development projects are wrestling with to try and make sure that the traffic generated not only by Metro, but also by the development projects doesn't stymie the entire area. So this is what is being vetted through the comprehensive planning process. The discussion that Fairfax County and Metro have been having is about what future parking demand there is for commuter parking specifically. And Metro has done a parking study that goes through 2040. As everybody knows, it's quite difficult to anticipate what parking needs are going to be that far out in advance, particularly given the amount of change that's going on right now, not only as it pertains to ridership, that's one thing, but also just the parking industry in general. So we are working through the details of that parking study because there are assumptions that are in there that Fairfax County does not necessarily agree with. But what we have both agreed to do, Fairfax County and Metro, is not to move forward with a compact hearing until we have agreed on what the underlying assumptions to that parking study are. And so that we would bring to the public a united recommendation or set of facts so that the public could give input on the number of spaces that we are proposing to reduce. So as I said, we're proposing up to 800, but over the next several months, as we are working through the comprehensive plan process with Fairfax County, if we decide to present fewer than a removal of 800, then we will do that. So no more than 800. Fairfax County believes that it should be closer to 600, and we will come to a common agreement before we go to compact hearing.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, Mr. Rouse next.
No questions or comments from me, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gideby?
No questions at this time. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Goldman?
Thank you. I'll defer to my Virginia colleagues, and I have no questions.
Great. Mr. Letourneau?
No, thank you very much to staff for working with Fairfax County on this. Nina alluded to some concerns about parking and Mr. Smenberg's questioning. And I think the approach going forward to work collaboratively when we get to that point makes a lot of sense. So I appreciate the work of both Fairfax staff and WMATA to enable the board to be able to move forward with this today.
All right, thank you. With that, I will close discussion on this item and ask the board corporate secretary to administer a roll call vote.
Chair McMillan?
Aye.
Vice Chair Meridian?
Aye.
Director Slater?
Aye.
And Director Smedberg?
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you. Now to our next item, termination of Prince George's County parking surcharge.
Okay, all right. There we go. Okay, today, staff is seeking multiple board approvals, all of which will result in the termination of the Prince George's County parking surcharge agreement. Specific board approvals needed to initiate this process include approval to use the accumulated parking surcharge reserves to defease the bonds issued by MDTA, approval to reduce the parking surcharge fee in Prince George's County to 0, and to terminate the parking surcharge agreement. In the early 1980s, when parking demand was high across the region, Metro and some of the local jurisdictions created a financing mechanism to pay for new garages, which is what the parking surcharge agreement enables. This was true for Prince George's County when Metro, the Maryland Transportation Authority, or MDTA, and Prince George's County signed a 3-party surcharge agreement in 2002. Funds were used to build parking garages at College Park, New Carrollton, and Largo Town Center. Today, we have accumulated enough funds in the parking surcharge reserve account to pay off MDTA's bond balance. All 3 parties to the agreement desire to do that and to terminate the parking surcharge agreement. To show how this financing mechanism works, we've illustrated the process. In the case of Prince George's County, the 3 parties entered into an agreement to establish the parking surcharge fee, which fee is embedded in Metro's daily parking rate that our commuters pay. MDTA issued bonds to finance the 3 garages I mentioned, and Metro today operates the garages, collects the parking surcharge fees, and in turn makes payments to MDTA, which they then apply to paying off their debt service. Over the years, the surcharge fee revenues have accumulated in excess of MDTA's debt service by approximately $2 million per year. In total, the current balance in the parking surcharge reserve account is $26.5 million, which means that there is enough money available to pay off MDTA's remaining debt, which is equal to approximately $18.3 million. This is something the MDTA is very interested in doing and agrees to moving forward with this action. There will be a balance left over once the bonds have been defeased, and the parties have agreed to place that balance into a new reserve account, which use of funds would include future parking projects in Prince George's County, station access improvements, and other improvements to promote TOD. Use of these funds in the future will require agreement by both Metro and Prince George's County. As I mentioned, today's approval initiates the process that will result in the termination of the parking surcharge agreement. If board approval is received today, the next steps include MDTA's defeasance of their bonds, termination of the ground leases under the 3 garages that were built using these bonds, and subsequently termination of the surcharge agreement. At that point, Metro can eliminate the parking surcharge fee and reduce the daily parking rate in Prince George's County. While not a part of this board approval, we have included into the FY22 budget the parking rate changes staff proposes once the surcharge fee is eliminated. In the docket for public hearing, we proposed to lower parking rates at all of Metro's parking garages in Prince George's County by 25 cents, except at Landover Metro, where the rate is already low and set at $3. This proposed parking rate change from $5.20 a day to $4.95 a day will bring in line the parking rates in Prince George's County with the parking rates in most of the other jurisdictions. There are 2 parking garages in Prince George's County at Addison Road and Prince George's Plaza, where the current parking rate is $4.70. We propose to lower these parking rates also by 25 cents with a final proposed rate of $4.45. With that, I will answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you. Before discussion, can I get a motion and a second from committee members?
This is Jeff Meridian. I'll make the motion.
Thank you.
I'll second that, Mr. Chair. Paul Smedberg.
Great. Okay, and I'll start with just a brief question, Ms. Albert. Am I correct that this type of parking financing arrangement is unique to the Maryland portion of our service area? Have we done similar type of surcharge and bonding arrangements in DC or Virginia?
We actually currently have 3 parking surcharge agreements. One is with Fairfax County. Another one is with Montgomery County. And then this is the 3rd one in Prince George's County. So we've had, those are the 3 jurisdictions in which we've applied them in the past.
And is the use of this something that was favored in the past and disfavored now, or just depends on the circumstances?
Yeah, there's no judgment to this financing mechanism actually works incredibly well for parking reasons. The surcharges, for example, in Fairfax County are being used to support the bonds for the new Silver Line garages, as an example. It just becomes another form of revenue that supports the construction of new garages where the system merits them. And so there's no judgment. It just happens to be that in Prince George's County, there's been a large accumulation of the surcharge, and the surcharge agreement stipulates that when you can defease or pay off the bonds, that you go ahead and do so that you can reduce, in fact, the cost of parking to the commuter. So that's really the benefit of eliminating it or terminating it now. And we have a lot of options in the future. We anticipate that there may be needs in the future for new garages in Prince George's County to be able to make way for TOD. So this mechanism is something that Prince George's County and WMATA could revisit and use when the time is right and sign a new parking surcharge agreement. But we don't see that need in the very foreseeable future.
Okay, I was just trying to ensure that the desire to move to termination was due to the maturity of these particular garages rather than anything about the mechanism itself. Okay, thank you.
Exactly.
Mr. Meridian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any questions.
Secretary Slater.
Good morning. Thank you. No questions, but just be aware I'm going to recuse myself from this item as the chairman of the MBTA board.
Okay, Ms. Ellison, when it comes to the vote, do we need to do something, or are we okay with just having an absence from Maryland on the vote?
That's fine. It's committee, so it's just the majority.
Okay.
It's fine. Yep.
Okay.
He's recused, so it's 3. That's no problem.
Understood. Okay, moving on, Mr. Smedberg.
No questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Rouse. Mr. Rouse.
No questions or comments, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gideby.
No questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Goldman.
No questions.
Mr. Letourneau.
Nothing for me.
Fantastic. Okay, we'll close discussion then. I'll ask the board corporate secretary to administer a roll call vote.
Chair McMillan,
Aye.
Vice Chair Meridian,
Aye.
and Chair Smedberg.
Aye.
The motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you. Now on to our final item, the authorization for public hearings on the fiscal year 22 budget and CIP. We having just considered this as an information item last week, I assume the presentation will be somewhat streamlined. But Mr. Weefeld, if you and the team would like to kick that off.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. They'll be bringing up the PowerPoint in a moment. And again, thank you for your earlier comments framing the discussion today, which is that this is the beginning of the process that we will be going through over the next few months. So the purpose of today's presentation is they ask the board approval to conduct compact hearings and again, begin the public comment period for the proposed fiscal year 22 budget presented last week, both operating and capital. We're at this point today because of the dramatic impact the pandemic has had on our finances. Unfortunately, the Federal CARES Act funding that has kept us operating for the last 9 months will run out in February. Without additional federal relief, we are facing an historic budget gap of almost $500 million. This gap is forcing us to consider drastic cuts, service cuts, layoffs of approximately 1/3 of our workforce, and actions that will hurt the region's post-COVID recovery. I want to be clear, like you and all the people and the businesses that depend on Metro services, I do not want to do any of these actions in the proposed budget. I'd rather be in a position to add service, and I look forward to the day when we can do just that. But at this time, and without firm dollar commitment, we need to take action now to prepare to seek public comment. With or without federal relief, we are required to have a balanced budget for the board's consideration this spring. If our delegation is successful and more funding comes, we can adjust and add more service back, as well as pull back on layoffs. The hearing process will be valuable to us in making those decisions, particularly if we only get a portion of the funds needed. What we hear from the public will help us in our decision making. I wish we were in a different place, but we're not, and we must begin to deal with the problem before us. Now I will turn over to Dennis Anasik, our Chief Financial Officer, and Tom Webster, who you've heard from earlier, to recap the presentations from last week on both the fiscal year 22 operating budget and the capital budget.
Thank you, Paul. I will cover the operating budget sections of the presentation, and Tom will discuss the capital budget. But I will start with the point that the GM made last week, which is that the proposal that WMATA is advancing for next year maintains Metro's safety focus. The proposal also caps operating subsidy to the mandated level by the region. In terms of service, the proposed operating budget aligns service with current Metro bus and Metro rail ridership levels, while allowing Metro to maintain progress on current equity initiatives. Overall, these principles will enable Metro to preserve as much bus and rail service as possible to support the region's recovery. This slide summarizes projected savings from bus and rail service adjustments needed to balance Metro's fiscal year 2020 budget. As you can see from this slide, the proposed Metro rail service changes headways on all lines. It eliminates weekend service, reduces weekend service span, limiting that to 9 p.m., turns back yellow, red, and silver line trains, and shuts 19 Metro Rail stations previously closed due to COVID-19. These changes on Metro Rail are projected to save $198 million. Changes to Metro bus service will save $105 million by limiting service to 41 lines to support mostly transit-dependent riders. But even with the bus and rail service reductions that I just described, Metro will still need an additional $160 million of capital support to balance the operating budget in fiscal year 2022. The slide that you're looking at this time provides additional details on Metro bus service. As I mentioned earlier, bus will be providing about 45% of the service level provided prior to the pandemic, which means that there will be limitations in terms of the number of lines that will be run. At this time, I will transfer the conversation over to Tom.
Thank you, Dennis. Again, I'm Tom Webster, Executive Vice President for Strategy, Planning, and Program Management. Through the proposed capital improvement program, Metro will continue to advance our priorities, improving system safety, reliability, and state of good repair. The capital program continues replacement and rehabilitation projects and programs and accelerates delivery of projects to address our overdue infrastructure and system needs. The proposed baseline FY22 or the proposed FY22 capital budget totals $2.8 billion. The proposed 6-year program totals about $12.5 billion, and the 10-year plan or 10-year outlook comes in at about $22 billion. Metro advances our capital projects through 6 capital investment categories. And our FY22 financial plan assumes federal formula funding, PREA funding, state and local contributions, $500 million in dedicated funding, and about $1.2 billion in dedicated funding supported debt. Following the board's approval, Metro will prepare for and open the public comment period in mid-January for 3 to 4 weeks. Public outreach will follow Metro's public participation plan, and we use digital, print, and in-person approaches. And we will gather feedback using virtual public hearings and an online survey. With that, Metro management recommends board authorization of compact public hearings and public participation activities for the proposed capital improvement program and the FY22 operating budget. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes our presentation.
All right, thank you. And before we begin our discussion, I would ask for a motion and a second from committee members.
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Moved by Mr. Smedberg and seconded by Mr. Slater, I think. Okay, so I will hold on any comments or questions from myself. I've made my observations at earlier stages, and as noted before, we will get deep into the substance of the budget proposal and the options we have when we have working sessions of this committee in the new year. So with that, I will recognize Mr. Meridian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. General Manager. Paul, can you just talk a little bit about, well, first of all, let me say thanks to the staff for all of the hard work in preparing for this. I think it goes without saying that we're in a difficult place that nobody wants to be in. And for the many of us who rely on Metro service every day, this is a tough and heartbreaking moment. The biggest concern I have, and you acknowledge this, Paul, in your remarks, is around making sure that the public is aware of where we are in this process, that this is more than just us right now as a local entity, that there's a bigger conversation that's being had. Can you speak to what the public outreach looks like, and in particular, those who may not have ready access to the information that we're putting out on our website? Can you just talk a little bit about what public engagement looks like?
I will. I'll have Lynn Bowersox also weigh in, who basically manages that for us. But I think a larger point that you just mentioned is, we're doing this budget in the context of literally things changing by the minute. Over the last week, with the proposal from Senator Warner, for instance, that he's been leading, which is fantastic that we have someone in their delegation leading that effort. We're very hopeful that something that changes very quickly there, and that again will help us, get a sense of where we end up by the end of the year. And we're all looking forward, hopefully, to something additional, in early spring. So all that will come into play. So I think it's important for the public to weigh in now, so we can get a better sense of, with whatever limited dollars we may have, what can we bring back, where does it make the most sense, and again, trying to meet the public demand. Ms. Bowersox, if you're here, if you want to get into a little bit more detail on some of the initiatives.
Yes, Mr. Wiedefeld, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So the board giving us this time allows us to do even more outreach to the public. We are translating the materials into at least 7 languages, and after we do some analysis to understand which communities most need the information, we may do more than 7 languages, depending on, because we have 26 spoken in the region, depending on the communities. We do advertise this docket in multiple languages in community publications. We will advertise digitally and on our own website, obviously have the materials available. We do signage that is posted throughout the system and on board our trains and buses that points people to opportunities for more information. We also put printed materials out through all of the jurisdictional office, through many of the service provider offices, public libraries, and so on. And so even those without with limited English proficiency or who don't have internet access are able to get this information. And the longer it's out there, the better chances we have of really driving that information forward. We'll also conduct, obviously, the compact public hearing, which we've had success with in the last year with virtual participation, obviously, and an extensive survey, which people can even take right from their phone to give us feedback on the proposal.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Paul, if we get an infusion of federal dollars, and I know that could look like a number of different things, how would it impact the process going forward?
Yeah. This is Paul Wiedefeld. Again, part of it will be the amount and the timing. As you know, we're working through the 21 budget right now. We have issues there. So depending on, again, what the amount would be and when it would flow, and if there's any requirements, because a lot of that is also being debated right now. Does it reflect the CARES Act? Is it something different in terms of how the dollars would flow? The documentation for that, as you know, that was part of the discussion with the CARES Act, is greater documentation. So I think we have to understand that more. Right now it's a little bit of a guessing game for all of us, but so we'll remain very flexible. But our team's ready to jump on that as quickly as possible. I can tell you we are working directly on the Hill, literally hour to hour. So we're monitoring the different aspects of this so that we are positioned to quickly move, and we will do that very quickly. We will, my priority is to get service back and get our people back, so we don't have to do the layoffs. So that's going to be, our biggest priority. What can we do to prevent those layoffs, which translates into more service?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Those are my questions.
Great. Next, Secretary Slater.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Meridian's questioning really answered a lot of my questions, but just maybe a few comments, and try to be pretty clear that this budget illustrates, a crisis, and we really do need some help. Public transportation nationally, my mind is in crisis and needs help. And one of the real true challenging aspects of where we are today is that pre-pandemic, I do feel like transit ridership, supporting development and service, we're truly all headed in the right direction. So, it's going to be on us to make sure we get back there. But, if anyone took the time to read the New York Times article this weekend, we're not alone. New York City's transit is looking at a $6.1 billion deficit. Boston, there's $600 million. Chicago, very similar. None of these proposals are great, but these budget issues, if we do not get federal help, are very real. And so that being said, these processes do take time, and it's important to me personally that we hear really what is truly important to our customers in these proposals. And I feel like starting now allows us to take that extra time in doing so. It's even more challenging in a remote environment, so we need to take that extra time to get that appropriate feedback. It's important to me that we understand where those priorities are. Is it frequency? Is it particular routes? Is it station access? Is it turnbacks? Those types of things are really important, and we have to hear that as we adjust and make decisions and move forward with whatever we have to if we do not get help. But in my mind, we have to always plan for the worst and adjust as things improve. And I'm hopeful that, as my colleagues are, I'm sure that we're going to have a solid vaccine strategy, and we're going to get some help from the federal government, and we're going to return back to normal ridership. But it seems that's going to take some time. So if things progress and there are opportunities to slow things in the middle of this, I do believe we can do that. But I believe we have a responsibility and obligation to start right now. So I just don't have an alternative, and I think it's important to get that public feedback. So just thank you. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Smedberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to pick up on what Secretary Slater just said, and I think what the general manager highlighted in his opening remarks. And to me, starting this process and getting that public feedback up front is going to be really important. I think, I want to hear that, know that. So if we are making adjustments, or we're lucky enough to be making adjustments, we understand what priorities are, not only of our riders and the public, but also of the jurisdictions. We need to hear from them as well as to what their priorities are and how this fits into their transit plans now and into the future. I think a lot of this, to me, has highlighted, and the calls that the general manager and I participated on a week ago now or so, was the fact how important Metro is to everyone, and how it is perceived as and will be a main foundation, if not the foundation block, in helping the region recover economically after this pandemic. And I think that is so important. I think procedurally we can adjust. We have done that in the past, and I think we can obviously do that in the future. Not only getting public comment in early, but I think it's also important to understand that given this particular challenge, Mr. Wiedefeld and his staff are going to need time. As the chair highlighted, Mr. McMillan highlighted earlier, we're going to need documents. We're going to need documentation and things that we may not have needed in the past, and that's going to take time. There's going to be a complexity here that, we haven't dealt with. So I too want to see the process start. As Secretary Slater just said, I honestly don't see an alternative. We are required. Our main responsibility is the fiduciary health of this organization, and we're required to propose and submit a balanced budget. I don't see how we can do that. We certainly can't do that by building a budget on hope. We have to deal with the reality of things, and if that changes, again, we can make adjustments. And as several people have said already, there is one thing that we are all unanimous on and in agreement on, is that these changes are draconian. It's the first time really that we've ever had to deal with this as an authority and as a region. Transit is in crisis, not only here, but throughout the country. And, I know and I hope that we are going to all work collaboratively and cooperatively, through this. And engagement is an important piece to this. So I'm going to be supportive of moving this forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Rouse.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to echo what everybody has said to this point. I think it's important to get this process started for a number of reasons, particularly to get the public input, right? To use a very seasonal reference, I see this as the ghost of Christmas future, right? This is not what is, but what may be in terms of if they continue on the route that we are. Obviously, we all hope that the situation changes, that it gets better, that some other form of revenue comes in to help us make some of these, address some of these shortfalls. But the reality is it could be what we're seeing or what we've proposed here. So we need to be prepared from a baseline to start there. It's easier, as the GM's explained, to add on service and to meet the needs of the metropolitan area by increasing service if we have the ability. But we've got to start somewhere, and a big part of that is getting input not only from citizens but also, stakeholders, and getting more information from funding partners here as to what they see as critical in terms of service level. Again, I don't see it as a static issue. I see it as something. This is just a starting point, as the GM said. Let's take it as that and not put too much weight in the numbers at this point. But let's let the process work itself out and see where we are as we move forward. But give us the ability to do that by starting now and giving us the time frame we need to make adjustments in the future if we can. So that's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. Next, Ms. Gideby.
I want to echo my appreciation to the staff for their work over the last year. It has been a very trying year. As I shared earlier, today marks my 1 year on being on the board, and it is more than I thought that I was signing up for. But I also appreciate the journey and being able to offer both ridership perspective and a regional perspective in addition to representing the district. My questions are really to just, I'm going to ask for more context for what we are doing differently. And then also ask that you provide me a little bit more understanding of, again, how we're showing up differently than we have in the past. I'd like to go to we can stay on maybe slide 15. Can you talk through when we say that we're going to be opening up the comment period, what we're exactly talking about? When will it be published? And then when will there be public comment? How long will public comment go for?
Okay. Lynn Bowersox, could you please comment on that and give some more information on that, please?
Sure. So as you can see on the slide, Ms. Gideby, that you recalled, the authorization allows us to provide legal notice of a compact public hearing in January, and that legal notice kicks off the public comment period. We then proceed to receive comments in writing through email, correspondence, et cetera, in addition to the hearing. At that point, we also start our outreach. We're out with street teams in the system. We're out with signage. We're out through the media. We're out through our own website and digital communications, communicating about what's in the proposal. We are out with a survey, which will gather thousands of participants to give us comments back. Am I answering your question?
No, I was hoping that you could give me specific dates. We were saying that what we're doing right now is creating the space for public comment. So when will the legal notice, we're approving this, and what is the timeline for the legal notice? What is the timeline for the public comment process?
Right, I'm going to ask the board secretary's office, Jennifer Ellison, to give you those specific dates. She's the manager of that part of the process.
So at this time, the legal notice is scheduled to be published on January 16th. That's a Saturday. That's the first legal notice. So that formally opens the comment period. Following that, the 23rd of January, we'll publish the second legal notice. We are required to give a 15-day notice for public hearings. So that's the purpose of legal notice 1 and legal notice 2. We can begin public hearings the week of February 1st. So that's a Monday. We anticipate concluding the public hearings process that week, and then closing the comment period approximately February 9th. That's the schedule as it stands now.
Okay. And I guess I just want to understand again what we may be doing differently. So in terms of the legal notification, one of the things that I shared on Friday was that I believed it was important for us to be able to hold, to understand and gain more information, and also to ensure that we are putting the best budget forward. What I've gotten back in terms of feedback is the stress and the timing as it relates to staff and what may need to happen. I'm also holding the reality that I've been hearing from the writers. I'm grateful for the Writers Advisory Council and especially those from DC who have been able to offer a strong feedback as to what the implications of these cuts mean for them personally. As it relates to the public conversations that we are hoping to have, as we've been all saying that we want to see robust feedback, it essentially gives people 1 week to comment, and then we close comments as part of this. Can you explain a little bit more about kind of what makes that more robust than what we've done in the past, especially during this time of COVID? I also wanted to know, in terms of community organizations, advocacy groups, business leaders, similarly to when we started to really think about how we reopened the system, we set up many of those stakeholder meetings. Because this is different, will we be offering some of those, or are the only times for people to actually engage in a two-way process that 1 week, as you guys have outlined, to be able to provide their feedback for the most drastic cuts that we've had to date?
So I just want to be clear that it's not a 1 week window. It goes on for more than a month. We do have a list of 200 community-based organizations that we do reach out to for comment, and we will be available to conduct virtual meetings with organizations as they want us to come in and share information. We do make ourselves available to do that.
Will we be proactively going out to them, just given the cuts that we're offering, that we're putting out there? Is that part of our plan?
We always do reach out to those organizations. It is standard part of our public participation plan.
Okay, can you explain a little bit more about what that looks like in terms of what you will be doing? I understand standards, but this is a different time, unprecedented. So how are we proactively doing something different than what we've done in the past to ensure that we're getting the robust comments that we are all saying that we want to support?
We do email those organizations. We send them the docket materials. We send them information for their own newsletters to use to help their members understand the opportunities for public input. It's sort of a mini toolkit, if you will, that helps them do the outreach that tries to engage more of their either members or community-based organization representatives.
Will we be
that for the business community as well as for the community-based organizations?
Will we be holding stakeholder conversations like we did in the summertime?
I'm not sure what you're referencing.
When we were reopening the system, as we had those similar cuts of just having to be on lifeline services, we proactively reached out to the business community to make sure that we could hear from them. We reached out to major large employers who were still open, who were dependent on ensuring that their riders could get to work, that our riders could get to employment services. Given the drastic nature, are we considering some of those pieces as part of this outreach plan that we are trying to expedite so quickly?
Yes, we will.
Okay, and so is that outlined somewhere? What is the timeline for that as it stands?
We will provide the board with the timeline as soon as we have the docket and the actual plan of outreach finalized, which would be at the end of the month.
Okay. My other question is about surveys and mailings to people's homes. One of the things that we did so that we had a better temperature as to who would be impacted and how we were coming back online this year, we said that we were going to be doing individual surveys. Will that also be part of this outreach process?
So it's not individual surveys, but we do use traditional mail to people's homes in order to get them engaged in survey taking. We know that we don't typically get the representation that we want in surveys unless we do reach out. And we have found that postcards to homes with incentives, gift cards, that kind of thing, give us better results in terms of getting demographic representation in our surveys.
And so will we be doing that as part of this plan?
Yes, indeed we will.
Okay, and then my additional questions are really about one of the things that you talked about that I appreciated was that you were doing the community outreach in terms of language and translation. How is that different than what we've typically done?
So our plan calls for an analysis that looks on a community by community basis and determines where translations are most necessary. So it will vary from one participation campaign to another, which languages we're doing. 7 is our standard, but often we do more than 7. For example, we'll do multiple Asian languages, or we'll do Amharic, or we'll do Portuguese, because a bus route is proposed for change in a community where that's the primary language spoken. And so once we do go through the analysis, we do a community-based scope to see what languages are most needed. And that will be specific to this outreach as well.
Okay, so it sounds like you're telling me that similar things that we've done in the past. Is it my understanding that in terms of this budget and the cuts that we're doing, we will be essentially following the standards that we've used in the past? We're not necessarily doing anything more than we've done in the past as it relates to outreach with residents and with riders to ensure that we're getting feedback? Are we doing anything more and over and above than we've done in the past?
We do have a board-approved policy for our public participation plan, which sets a standard. We'll do everything in that standard, and obviously, given the extraordinary proposal that's before us, everything that we can do beyond it, such as the street teams and the presence in the system that we don't do for every outreach campaign, but we will do for this. And there'll be other tactics that we use in order to ensure that we maximize public input into this process.
I just have 3 more questions and then I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to really understand how are we targeting those who are most impacted by the cuts that are happening? I hear that this is how we've done this on a standard mechanism. This is not a standard budget. And so how are we proactively going to the riders who are most impacted by this decision? Are we going to be doing anything different to ensure that we get to them?
I'm sorry, is that a question for me or was it for the chairman?
It's to Wamada, whoever, the chairman can answer that question. This is part of the stakeholder. Again, we're rushing this process because we feel like we need to get it out. We want to have a robust process, and I'm trying to understand what we are doing different. And I want to understand who we are targeting more intentionally. And so to the extent that you can speak to who we may be targeting more intentionally so that we can truly hear from them, it would just be more helpful for me.
Sure. So I actually believe that the board's approved PPP plan, the public participation plan, is proactive, strategic, and intentional in every aspect, okay? I think that when you see the final plan, which we are working to put together, you'll agree that it uses every channel and every tactic at our disposal to reach members of the community who are impacted by the budget, including on the system, which is often the most effective place to reach them. And when we've surveyed the public historically, they've said that the most effective place to get their input about any proposed change at Metro is while they are riding. So we do understand that getting to them while they're boarding buses and trains is a very important outreach opportunity that we will avail ourselves for in this round of public outreach. But we do many other tactics as well, and we'd be happy to give the board a memo that sets forth exactly what those specific tactics are.
Okay, thank you. My other question is around how we're seeking solutions in the survey. So one of the things that we have been saying is that we want to be able to hear from residents and how this impacts them. And the ways in which I've seen the surveys go out, they're often a one-way, what is the impact? It doesn't offer kind of a two-way value proposition to really get maybe sometimes the texture and depth of the impact. Are we doing anything differently so that we can actually really hear maybe new solutions I hear all of the board members talking about wanting to find a way out of this, that we don't know another way. And so we're going to put this out to the public to hear from them. As outlined, what I have heard from this team is that we will have a 1-week public process in which people can offer that level of feedback. There will be surveys. We will be using the standards that we've always used, even though we're in a global pandemic. We will reach people in the system, even though folks are not writing the system, and in part that's why we're here. So I just want to just also understand, for the survey itself and the survey questions, will we be offering the space to truly hear from the writers?
We will ask open-ended questions and ask for comments beyond what the question multiple choice offers. So in other words, people taking the survey will be able to offer their own ideas and thoughts about changes that they would prefer.
Okay. I thank you all for your diligence as part of this. One of the things that I have been that I've tried to maintain as part of being part of this board is to just ensure that I am representing the unheard voices that are often not able to participate in these types of conversations, and unseen faces that we may not necessarily know to go out to and reach out to very intentionally. And so for me, it is really important to really understand where we are in terms of just the final plan, especially as it relates to the public engagement process and outreach process as part of that. I appreciate this board wanting to expedite this as soon as possible. One of the things that I had requested on behalf of DC, my appointing authority, was for us to hold until the new year for several reasons, including the fact that I wanted us to hear from Congress and see what all our options were. I also thought that it was important that we didn't put something out before the holiday season, that we could actually leverage the board's timeline of the 14th as an opportunity to really re-engage, think through our process, understand what the plans are, see how they impact us, and then move forward. As outlined, especially with the legal notice being on the 16th, it doesn't seem like there's much that changes in between that time. We still won't have the information that we need, but we will be voting on a final plan that goes out without necessarily seeing what that fully looks like. And so I will be voting no on moving forward, because I do think it's important that we do something different. I do think that we should engage more intentionally. I do think that this is a different time than we've ever seen before. And so it's important that we do, and we really think about new ways to engage, not necessarily in the standard ways. So I just thank you for the time in indulging me. And the only final thing that I would say is that to date, I'm not sure that I've asked on behalf of the district to request a tabling of any topic. To date, I'm not sure that there has ever had to be a justification for why that needed to happen. But to date, I find myself having to stand on the principle that it's important for us to ensure that we really think through how we engage the public properly. And I understand that as being my truth, but I really hope that we will really consider all of the implications of what this means for residents and riders, for the region, and for the district. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gideby, and appreciate your focus on the details and the quality of the outreach. This is an unusual circumstance in which to be trying to engage members of the public, especially out in the system. So I appreciate your attention to that detail. Ms. Ellison, could you just clarify one data point? There were a couple of mentions of 1 week, and I think what I heard you say is that that specific scheduled public hearings would take place over the course of about a 1 week period, but that the total public comment period is actually more of a 3 to 4 week range. Can you just clarify 1 week versus whatever the total range is?
It's approximately 3 weeks, January 16th to February 9th.
Okay, and did I hear correctly that the scheduled public hearings are concentrated in that particular period, February 1st?
Yes,
Okay,
February 1st. And that's because we were required to notice those hearings 15 days after the public comment period opens. So the purpose of the legal notices on the 16th and the 23rd provide that 15-day notice so that we can begin hearings on February 1st.
I appreciate that clarification for all of us. Next, Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When this matter was before,
Is that an ominous sign that you had to take a drink first?
absolutely. Before any good filibuster, you have to be prepared, I guess. When this matter was before the committee last week, I expressed my reservations about taking this budget to public hearing at this time. And regrettably, I must say that I haven't changed my mind very much in the intervening period. When we dealt with the budget last year for FY21, we didn't take that vote until our meeting in January. So that would have been January 2020. And so I see no reason why we shouldn't follow that precedent and delay a vote on this budget proposal until January. Reason why I think we should do that is because in the interim, we will learn a lot of information. We will learn and be able to answer a lot of the questions that the general manager has. We will learn what Congress is going to do in terms of providing COVID aid for the transit industry. We'll learn how much of that aid there will be in dollars. We'll probably know, in fact, we will know how that aid will be distributed among the various transit properties across the country. So we'll know how much money WMATA will probably get as a result of that exercise. In addition, we can expect next week the FDA to approve the COVID vaccines by Pfizer and Moderna for use in the United States. And that will mean, and hopefully they'll be able to tell us how many Americans will then likely be vaccinated over the next first 6 months of 2021. The president-elect announced this week that his goal is to vaccinate 100 million Americans in his first 100 days. So that's by the end of January, February, by the end of April. And so others in this administration have talked about vaccinating up to 60 or 70% of all Americans by the summer of next year. Those two ingredients, how much money we will get from Congress and how many people will be vaccinated, make this a much different picture of what FY22 starting in July 1st is going to look like. And I think we would benefit from having that information and before we go out asking the public to comment on what otherwise is a fairly drastic doomsday budget. I mean, providing Metro Rail headways at 30 minutes, closing 19 stations, and no service on weekends is doomsday. Offering Metro bus service at 45% of pre-COVID levels is a pretty awful pattern of service. So I think we would value from taking the time and waiting another month and knowing what the world is going to look like beginning next summer before we present a budget and ask people to comment. Now, I also have some very substantive objections to this budget, which I explained last week when this came, and so I'll be very brief in describing them again. But if we do have a large percentage of people vaccinated by next summer, I think we can have a budget that's much more progressive than the very conservative budget that's the basis for these service patterns. I see no reason why we shouldn't be able to have a budget where we project 70% of pre-COVID levels by June of 22, not June of 21, but a year later, June of 22, not the 30%. That's the very conservative goal projected by this budget. And I believe that that's achievable in light of the broad COVID vaccinations that will occur beginning, well, that will take place by summer 2021 and continuing through the rest of of 2021. I oppose the closing of these 19 stations to riders, as well as the elimination of weekend service. If we need savings, then I would just leave the stations unmanned, but I would leave them open. They involve 4 stations in Maryland. Grosvenor, another one is College Park. Now we expect students to go back to school in the fall. What sense does it make to close the College Park station that serves the University of Maryland? And in that vein, if people are coming back and we expect tourists to come back to Washington next summer, what sense does it make to close the Smithsonian station when visitors are going to come back to Washington and want to visit the Smithsonian museums? This makes no sense. I also oppose the turnbacks, especially on the red line that we've talked about before. What sense does it make to close Grosvenor and close that station and tell people that they have to get off at Medical Center if they want to go beyond Grosvenor, but yet run those trains empty past the Grosvenor station so they can turn back at that point? That makes absolutely no sense. And the stations at the end of the line, Shady Grove, is going to lose service as a result of those turnbacks to half the service that it would enjoy. It would enjoy service instead of at 15 minutes for parts of the red line, it would be at 30 minutes. Now, Shady Grove currently has 1,400 daily boardings. That's roughly the same level of daily boardings as Farragut West with 1,500 or Medical Center with 1,100 daily boardings, all of which will, under the proposed budget, will receive much better service than Shady Grove. And why am I focused on Shady Grove? Because Shady Grove serves the area of Montgomery County that has a good deal of affordable housing. It's the housing where a good deal of the essential workers reside for our county. It's the area where the nurses, where the construction workers, where the other essential workers that have been sustaining the economy since March reside. So why, if they're using the service, and why, if this is a station that receives one of the highest levels of daily boardings now, would you want to put out a budget that tells them that their service is going to cut back and they will be only getting service every 30 minutes, while some other downline stations are getting service on 15-minute intervals? It makes no sense. The turnbacks make no sense. Turning to Metrobus for a moment. The proposal would eliminate Metrobus service in Montgomery County on 3 of the critical corridors. There would be no longer service on the T2 that runs out River Road, on the L8 that runs out Connecticut Avenue in Montgomery County, and some of the Z routes that serves Colesville Road on the eastern part of the county. If that comes to pass, Metrobus will become almost invisible in Montgomery County. I don't think that makes sense to have, a Metrobus that is no longer a vibrant part of of Montgomery County. I think that's a mistake for not only riders, but for Metro and the regional Metrobus service plan. And the final point on Metrobus, if we do go through with this plan that has on the red line no weekend service and no service after 9 p.m., then there's a need for bus service along that Wisconsin Avenue, Rockville Pike corridor to replace the red line after 9 p.m. on weekends. Are we going to just deprive riders along that red line corridor of any kind of substitute service by bus after 9 p.m. on weekends? I hope not. Finally, what's my prediction? My prediction is that this doomsday budget will never be implemented for fiscal year 22. But the problem is, to make it the focus of discussion and debate for the next 4 months will only discourage riders to return to the Metro system in the summer and fall, that we hope that they will be able to return as the system comes back to normal. We're going to offer them a fairly good pattern of service for January through June. with 15% headways on Metro Rail and 75% of pre-COVID levels of service on Metro Bus. That's a pretty good transition into a recovery period that I would think is going to start in summer and fall. And it's, but if we keep telling them that what they're going to face are 30-minute headways and no service on weekends, I think we're just going to discourage them from coming back to the system. We're going to discourage them from riding Metro. They're either going to stay home or they're going to stick to their cars in coming into the city on the days that they do commute into the cities. And I don't think it's fair to our workers, our essential workers and operators who have been sustaining this service since March to needlessly let them think that 2,400 of them will lose their jobs come July 1st of next year. I think that's a mistake to do as board members for our workers who have been carrying us through since March. So to summarize, let me just paraphrase the bard William Shakespeare, who I should say as a side, one of his descendants was one of the first to receive the COVID vaccine. In Britain this week, a gentleman named Mr. Shakespeare. But I think we are engaged in a process that will produce a lot of sound and fury, but in the end will signify nothing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Goldman. We'll turn now to Mr. Letourneau.
That's a tough one to follow, Mr. Chairman. Speaking of sound and fury, that's a tough one to follow. But I understand everybody's passionate feelings on this. And I could certainly sit here and pick apart all the things I don't like in this initial preliminary budget proposal, because there are a lot of them. If we're going to talk about bus service, the entire Commonwealth of Virginia is down to fewer than 6 bus lines total in this scenario. The Silver Line obviously doesn't run all the way through from Ashburn into the district as all of us had planned, and has all the Virginia jurisdictions and the Commonwealth have been investing in billions of dollars for years. So there's a lot of things. But I think the reality is, unfortunately, absent a change in revenue, absent new revenue, then the type of layoffs and the type of things that we're putting out for public discussion are going to happen. And so the question will be, what happens in the intervening period? And there is a process element to this that I think perhaps is being lost in some of the recent comments, which is, and I'll ask the general manager. So let's just play it out scenario wise. If there is aid coming, if Congress does pass some sort of package that includes aid, which is likely to be short term, what then would staff have to do? It's not as if staff would simply be able to overnight change the docket and be able to be ready at the same timeline to go out for public process. So Mr. General Manager, can you just walk us through from a process standpoint what actually has to happen? And then could you reasonably be able to even assume from that what revenue changes would be in this budget? And then how would you possibly be able to decide which of all these elements that you would put back in versus put out for public comment? Isn't that an awful lot to accomplish in a short period?
It would be extremely difficult. It would, to be frank, I'm not sure we could do it. You would literally have to rebuild the whole process back up. By this approach, we can add service in because we're starting off with, in effect, what we hope none of us ever have to deal with. And we can bring it back. Similar to what we just did with the 21 budget. When we were able to bring back, for instance, we were at that initial thinking was we could only afford up to 9 p.m. on the rail service, but we came back and added 11 p.m., for instance. So the same thing could play out now. If we have to wait and then rebuild, in effect, what is that we're asking the public to comment on, it will have to be another whole set of assumptions, right? some of which the federal money, maybe we will have a better sense of the discussions going on right now, but we could be in the same discussion. Well, let's wait a few more months because maybe something comes out in March or April, with the new administration. And then the same thing with ridership. We won't know ridership until we see ridership. We don't know the vaccine until we see how it's taken, right? So, I'm not sure where we ever draw that line, but we do have a budget process that we have to basically have prepared by, in effect, spring for lots of reasons. Some of it is for local governments, some of it is for state governments, and some of it's for the federal process. So that's what you'd have to, literally you'd have to start all over. And then a lot of the factors would still be, I wish they were all nailed down. I wish we all had it and we could move forward, but we don't. And that's the environment we're in now. I think we've shown in the 21 budget how we have been able to adjust. That is our approach. That's exactly what we're gearing up for. We want to do that. And that's why we're working so hard with the Hill right now. Let's get as much as we can so that we can start to do that. So just from a pure process, and that is no excuse. I mean, I understand, the pressure that we're all under, but it's also a reality. I mean, it is a reality. We have
the consequence of doing that then would be a compressed public input period at a time when I think we all agree there should be more of a public input period. Looking historically, this 3.5 or so week period is longer than what a normal period has been for Metro, particularly in years when the board is not authorized going out to public docket early. There's some big differences between last year and this year. One of them is, even under, I think, the most rosy scenario in which vaccinations occur rapidly and Congress provides a lot of aid, unfortunately, I think we still will need to lay off some people. So that in and of itself is a process and a discussion and a timeline that is different than in previous years when we were not contemplating those sorts of things. So it is very different. I think ultimately the approach that local governments take typically when preparing a budget is to advertise a tax rate that is higher than what is ultimately adopted by that jurisdiction. And we do that because it allows us to discuss every possible addition to the budget and allows for different scenarios to play out during the public process. So I personally, quite frankly, don't want to put staff in a position of having to decide at the last minute which item or two here they would potentially try to save if a scenario improved in the next couple of weeks. I think what we need to take out of public input, obviously, we know the public input is going to be negative. I hope it is. People aren't going to like this. But what we need to understand from this is, of all these bad choices we have to make, which ones are the worst? Because there's no doubt in my mind we will have to make bad choices in this budget. I hope it's not all of these bad choices, but we have to be able to weigh them against each other. And the more time we have and the more public input we have for each of these things that are on the table, the better. So I really prefer an approach where everything that's negative gets put out to the public, because that's our reality today. I mean, our reality is without an infusion of revenue or other cash, this is what we have to do. We hope it improves, but I think this approach allows us for the maximum amount of public input into it, and it allows for us to consider the most number of things and the most number of factors as we decide, if we do have additional revenue, what to put back in. So I am not a member of the committee. I won't be voting on this motion in committee, but when we get to the board, I will support it. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your comments, Mr. Letourneau, and to all my fellow board members. Obviously, this is one of the most difficult agenda items to come before this board or any committee in quite some time, and appreciate the thoughtful and professional comments that have taken place. So with that, I'm going to close discussion on the item and ask the board corporate secretary to administer a roll call vote for the committee members.
Chair McMillan?
Aye.
Vice Chair Meridian?
Yes.
Director Slater?
Aye.
Director Smedberg?
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes.
All right, thank you. And with no further business to come before the committee, we stand adjourned. There'll be a brief break before the beginning of the Safety and Operations Committee meeting, so please stay tuned.